Hello and welcome back to Our WWII Dad. I'm Chris Cangilla, of course, alongside my brother Ken Cangilla. And whether you've been with us for a while or you're joining us for the first time, we're thrilled that you're here. We started this podcast to honor our father, Private First Class Louis Cangilla, a replacement soldier with the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate, famously known as the Viking Battalion, who served in Europe during World War II. But it's not just about our dad. We're also here to share stories of other veterans that we've discovered along the way. In previous episodes, we spoke with those veterans' families, sons, daughters, grandkids, even nephews and nieces, who keep their legacies alive, just like we're trying to do here. We're so excited to explore even more stories of the greatest generation here today and in future episodes.
That's right, Chris. And, as you and I have discussed in the past, we think it's really important to preserve this history for posterity. We're getting further and further away from that generation. We're losing so many of them that it's important to record these stories. And I think that's the reason you and I started to do this. It's why we're expanding it to talk to other family members from veterans so that we can capture their stories as well. And really, it all started with my trip to Europe in the spring of 2023. I was sending you texts from Europe saying, look at this picture. This is where Dad was. And, it got you excited about it, too. And so when I got back, you said, hey, rather than just share, texts and conversations about this, let's put it down in the form of a podcast. And I really welcome that idea because I wanted to preserve it for our family. And now it's grown even beyond that so that we can share the places that I went to, like Verslin and Aachen in Germany. We went to Malmedy and saw where Dad was during the Battle of the Bulge and followed in his footsteps all the way into Norway to see exactly where he had been and see it through his own eyes in much of a country that didn't change that much since World War II. So it was really quite a unique experience.
Yeah, it was remarkable to see all those places and see the way it used to look like and what it looks like now. It's an incredible thing you went through, and I'm so happy that you did agree to be on that podcast with me. And I never get tired about chatting of all those things that you got to do. But Ken, in this special episode, we're going to turn the spotlight on a journey of my own. Recently, I took a trip to Southern California to explore some historic World War II sites and catch up with my good friend, Pat Pattison. Pat's the creator and host of Pat Pattison's Best of California, where he takes viewers on adventures to hidden gems and must-see spots in California, airing every week on MeTV in Los Angeles. But the best part, Ken, is that Pat has a World War II dad of his own. And I'm excited for him to join us and swap stories about our fathers and reminisce about the time that he and I spent in Los Angeles looking at all those sites.
That's great that you had the opportunity to do that, Chris. And I can't wait to talk to Pat about what his experience has been like in looking into the history of his dad in World War II as well. Speaking of trips, I had the opportunity to go to a special exhibit that was at the History Colorado Center. I was invited by a fishing buddy of mine, Rick Cooker, who is a carpenter who helps build the sets where they put the exhibits. And there was a special exhibit taking place and it was about to leave. He said, you need to get down here. So my wife and I went down there to visit the exhibit, and it was an exhibit based on the 10th Mountain Division at Camp Hale. And the reason I wanted to go, as you know, Chris, is the 99th Infantry Battalion also trained at Camp Hale. So it's near and dear to our hearts. So we went to the museum, and Rick took us to the special section, and we walked in. And the first thing we see is a very unique item that I've never seen in any of the World War II history that I've studied. It was a Finnish latte, and it sounds like a coffee, doesn't it?
Can I have one? Wait a minute, I think I have one right here.
Yeah. It's Finnish, as in Finland, and it's Lahti, and a Lahti L39 20 millimeter anti-tank rifle. And what made it unique, Chris, is this thing is built on steel skis. So talk about mountain warfare. These guys had a gun that was designed, and it looks like it could be pulled by a man or maybe a mule.
How big do you think
probably
it
fairly
is?
heavy. Oh, it's probably 5 feet long and maybe 24 inches wide. So, it's a
Pretty
pretty good
heavy then,
caliber
right? And
gun.
pretty,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I
And
guess
then
it'd
you'd
have
have
to
to.
be, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I guess it'd have to be pretty large to take out a tank. It can't just be something small like that, right?
Right. Yeah, it's 20 millimeter. She's 20 millimeter ammunition, so pretty good sized barrel on that thing. And it was really unique to take a look at that. And they had one from the war right there in the museum, one of the first exhibits you get to see. So really enjoyed checking that out. And then the next thing you get to see is they have a ski trooper all decked out in their winter warfare gear, which is all in white. And you and I talked about them wearing white when we looked at the statue up at Vale that they have for the 10th Mountain Division. And so they have a mannequin there that's fully decked out, and it's got the white on, got the ski poles, and then the goggles to protect their eyes from the bright sunlight that you would experience on those sunny days with snow all around you. So it was neat to see that. And then they take you to kind of how they lived. And the interesting thing about how they lived is they had these two-man pup tents. And once again, they were white to blend in with the snow. And they have a cutout so you can see what it looks like inside the pup tent. And, it's just a white canvas with a couple of sleeping bags in there. It had to be brutal to survive those temperatures in the winter.
Yeah, yeah, and those white outfits that they used, they're more like a coverall, right? They weren't any kind of warmth to them. They were just to help you blend in so you're going to get shot or something like that.
That's exactly right. So it was simply camo. I'm sure they could take it off if conditions changed, but yeah, it's definitely just a white covering. So the next thing that you walk over to see after the tent is you get a witness on display an M1 Garand rifle, and it has a bayonet with it, and the bayonet's actually scarred up from battle in Italy. So it was one of the 10th Mountain Division soldiers' bayonet that was actually used in battle. And the thing I liked about looking at that rifle again is it reminded me of the exact same rifle Dad carried in World War II that weighed about 8 pounds, and he carried that on his shoulder through a number of areas of Germany and Belgium that he went to. And so to see that rifle up close was really kind of neat.
It's funny that you bring that up because a little bit later we're going to talk about the things I discovered when I was out in California. And in that discovery, I talked with a gentleman who really knew a lot about these things, and he said that rifle is huge. And with Dad being just 5'6", it goes from his, mid thigh over his head. And like you said, it weighs 8 pounds. It was a huge rifle for him to carry. And what we learned is he's pretty talented with it too.
Yeah, he was a sharpshooter. That's for sure. Yeah. So after seeing the rifle up close, then we got into the transportation section, and this was really unique. So they have on display it's made out of plastic, I think, but it's a mule. And at Camp Hale, the 10th Mountain Division and the 99th worked with mules to carry their equipment. And they had over 5,000 mules up there at Camp Hale to haul their equipment around. And they had to get used to working with the mules, feeding them, taking care of them, getting them to do what they wanted them to do. And, mules can be very stubborn.
Yeah.
So, so in addition to the mule, we went from the old time to the more modern times. They developed a vehicle they called the Weasel. It was the M29 Weasel. And it's this tracked vehicle. It's like a mini tank almost, but it doesn't
Like
have
a
any real
snowcat almost?
firepower. Almost, but there's a good description, like a snowcat. And they were painted black and white to blend in with the snow and the shadows in the snow kind of terrain. And they had room for one driver and then about three passengers in the back seat that they could transport men quickly across the snow to get them to different areas. And I'm sure they mounted some type of gun on there. The one I saw didn't have a gun mounted on it, but I'm sure it had the ability to mount a gun on there.
I've seen photos of those before, I think, and I think they're made by Studebaker, which is, of course, a manufacturer back in that
Yeah,
era of
yeah,
these large, big tank-like cars. So it makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah. Yeah, and then moving down through the museum after that, you get to a display that's a salute to the ladies, and they had on display what the WACs wore back in the day.
Oh, that is so cool. Of course, the WAC. We've been talking about that, and for those that don't know, the WAC or the women that serve in the WAC stood for Women's Army Corps, and it was a branch of the United States Army that served during World War II, and it was created in 1943, and over 150,000 women served in the WAC during the war. And I'm so excited to hear you talk about it and that it exists because we have been dying to get a family member of a whack, if you will, a World War II mom or grandmother. So if you have one of those, if you have a relative that was a whack, please let us know because we got to represent the ladies here on World War II Dad. What else did you see, Ken?
Yeah, so in addition to seeing the whack mannequin and see what the women wore which was really great. Right next door to that, it was a small nod, but they did give a nod to the 99th Infantry Battalion because this was really an exhibit for the 10th Mountain Division, and they did have a poster for the 99th Infantry Battalion there that talked about them training there as well. But the reason they only get a small nod is the 10th Mountain Division was about 15,000 men compared to the 99th, which was under 1,000 men. So the Viking Battalion was a much smaller specialized unit. The 10th Mountain Division was huge, and they had big plans for it in Italy. So it was nice to get a little nod for the good old 99th Infantry Battalion separate. The
Absolutely.
next thing I saw that was really interesting that I had never heard this story before and had no idea this took place is they actually housed some German prisoners at Camp Hale, which, by the way, is near Leadville, Colorado. It's halfway between, say, Vail and Leadville along Tennessee Pass. So they would bring these German prisoners all the way to the United States, all the way to the mountains in Colorado, and they had German prisoners of war there. Well, there was an American engineer that worked at the camp, and he was a Nazi sympathizer, and he actually helped two of the POWs escape from Camp Hale, and he went with them, and they traveled and they got all the way into Texas to the Mexico border. Yeah, and they actually were about to cross into the border when they were captured and turned over to the Texas Rangers. And the Texas Rangers could not believe these guys had come, first of all, that they were Germans and that they had come all the way from Camp Hale. So they were returned back to Camp Hale. The American that helped them was sentenced to jail for tyranny. He was released much later after the war, but he was sentenced to jail. So
I
that's an
just
interesting side story to Camp Hale.
I just can't understand why, if you captured a German soldier in Europe, why you would go to the expense to ship him all the way to the United States, to the middle of the United States, truck him up to the mountains, and keep them there. That just it doesn't make any sense. Although it'd be very difficult to escape without help, of course, because it's very cold and very snow-packed. But a German soldier might be more apt at doing that than maybe a soldier from Japan.
Right, right. It is interesting that they took them that far. I don't know if they had fear that, if the country was attacked on the coast, that they could free the prisoners if we gave up
That's
ground there
good.
or something. So to use the middle of the United States made sense. And they even had prisoners of war camps in Greeley, Colorado, too. And there were German prisoners up there as well.
That's interesting, but you make a good point
Yeah,
for sure. What else you
yeah.
see?
So from there, you move your way through the museum, and they have a full display of what the German mountain troops wore. And I don't know because I've seen German troops in white, but these German troops were in camouflage. So I don't know if these were summer mountaineering type uniforms, or they hadn't developed the white overcloth yet, which they used primarily in the Russia area. So it was interesting to see what they wore, and their camouflage was more advanced than ours for sure.
Yeah, it seemed like during World War II, as far as I can see with all the photos, we just went with green for the most part, maybe some shades of brown,
Yeah.
not like the camouflage you see of today's era.
Yeah, yeah, they were definitely advanced in that area for sure. And then we moved on and we came across a 60 millimeter M2 mortar on display, which I'd never seen one of these up close. And if you watch any war film, the mortar played a big part in helping our troops, either advance or retreat. They could definitely seal off an area and give the troops some breathing room on the ground. And the size of those rounds were really incredible to see them up
What do you
close.
think? How big?
Oh gosh, with the tail on the round, they were probably, I don't know, 8 to 10 inches long, and
Like
and,
a
and then
skinny football, maybe?
yeah, well, the end looks like definitely like kind of a skinny football on that end, and then the tail makes it about 8 to 10 inches long.
Well,
So yeah,
I'll
deadly
tell you
weapon.
what, it's interesting, and you mentioned that they use it quite a bit. When you hear about them softening up an area, is that
Mhm.
when they're using a lot of these mortar shells?
That's right, Chris. They would often pound an area with mortar shells before they'd send the infantry in. And what that would do is get the enemy to duck for cover and not see the infantry troops moving in. So they were a huge friend to the infantrymen for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything
Yeah.
else?
Yeah, so then this was interesting. They had a Nazi banner, not just a flag, but one of those long banners that had been captured by the 10th Mountain Division. And then the guys that captured it were from the 10th Mountain Division, 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, E Company, and they signed it. So I took a closer look at the signatures on there, Chris, and even one of the soldiers from E Company was from Grand Lake, Colorado. So an old boy that could ski from Grand Lake joined the 10th Mountain Division and got a souvenir of a Nazi banner.
That's incredible. What an
Yeah.
experience he must have and the tales to tell, right?
Exactly, yeah. And then the next weapon we saw was a bazooka, an M1A1 bazooka. And boy, you see a lot of bazookas in the military history as well. Very good at knocking out tanks and knocking holes in buildings where when they needed to. So it was kind of neat to see that up close. And I learned something that I never knew about bazookas. They're named after an instrument that was created by a comedian named Bob Burns. He invented this kind of funny looking instrument. It's kind of a joke. He probably took a trumpet and modified it. He invented it, and it was popularized in the 1930s in his act. And the soldiers were familiar with the bazooka, and this thing looked like it, so that's how it got its name.
So it's got his nickname from a comedian. That's incredible. It's also something that I don't think in my mind is associated with any other war than World War II. You don't talk about bazookas in Vietnam or bazookas in anything else. And of course, you got, was it a cartoon strip that used to come with candy, kind of like the old gumball? Bazooka Joe, right?
Yes, yes, that's right. I'd
Yes.
forgotten about that.
So I'm not
Yeah,
sure when that came out either, but
yeah.
yeah, bazookas is a name I think is truly associated with World War II, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So seeing one of those right there was very interesting. And then the last thing they take you through is more of the souvenirs that the soldiers brought home. And that reminded me of the souvenirs Dad brought home in his duffel bag because there were two things in that collection of souvenirs that really hit home with me. One was a Nazi flag about the same size as the one Dad had brought home. But the second thing that just shocked me was there was a souvenir of an Italian Beretta pistol model 1935, if you can believe that.
That sounds very familiar in things we've talked about because Dad got a Beretta pistol, and that was from he won it from the Crown Prince of Austria or something like that, right?
Yeah, so the story is that when Dad was in Regensburg at the end of the war, like it was April or May 1945, it was real close to the end of the war, he and two other soldiers got called up to Austria to help the Crown Prince Joseph of Austria because he had what they called displaced persons passing through and he felt threatened by them. So Dad and these two other soldiers went up there to move the displaced persons along. And the Crown Prince was so thankful for what they had done. He said, I want to gift you this Italian Beretta pistol. So they drew lots for it, and Dad won it and brought it home. And Chris, it looks identical to the one at the museum that the 10th Mountain Division soldier brought home as well.
Yeah, we'll put up a side by side, and they absolutely look identical. So what an incredible visit you had, and it's so kind of cool because you probably had to travel maybe an hour to get there, where I had to go from Chicago, fly out to Los Angeles to meet up with my friend to see all these incredible World War II sites in Southern California. So I'm so excited to introduce you to another son of a World War II dad, my good friend, Pat Pattison. Pat, welcome to our World War II Dad. It's so good to see you again, my friend.
Chris, so great to see you again. You were
Yes,
out here
sir.
and it was a ball, but it's great to be with you and your brother on this great podcast. I love your podcast.
Thank you,
Well,
sir.
thanks for saying so, Pat. It's great for me to meet you. Chris told me all about your trip. Sounds like a wonderful time. I wish I could have been there with you, but I'm really interested in learning about your World War II dad.
Well, thanks. So my dad, Raylinn Pattison, he also went by Pat, which is my name, and he was a career officer. So he jumped into the military before December 7th, and was in and out of the Navy. We don't quite know the story there, but then he came back into the Army and did all that we're going to talk about. So, and like your dad, I think, and like most of his generation, never talked about it, you know. And I know you come up, guys, I've watched enough of the podcast that you come up against that time and time again in terms of the stories. So
We sure have, Pat. And it's been great that Ken is able to been, a detective and put that hat on and really kind of retrace Dad's steps and learn as much as we can because they, like you said, they didn't talk about it that much at all. What do you know about any other close family members? Any of those saw action during World War II?
Yeah, well, I'm of an age, I was born in 1953, so it was just 8 years after the war that most of my contemporaries' fathers fought in the war. So it was not unusual at all. I think you guys, or at least you, Chris, are little. Your dad was younger, and so it was a little bit. I don't know if it's like a 10-year difference or something like that, but it was just enough of a difference that it's not unique. So virtually every neighbor I had in our neighborhood in Orange County fought, and my aunts and uncles too.
Yeah, there's 10 years between Ken and I.
Right.
So my dad was 40. Our dad, I always do that, Ken. I apologize. Our dad was 42 when he had me. But Pat, you're a native of California too, right?
That's right. That's right. Not only am I native, but my dad was a native, which is very unusual here in California. And my grandfather on my mom's side came here in the 1880s. So we're long time Californians, which is very unusual. And that's why I started the show that I work on, or host, because I just love the state. But it was you, Chris, that got me, and Ken, that got me interested in more of the World War II history here in California. Here again, I kind of just lived among it, and hiding in plain sight.
Yeah. Pat, what always intrigues me is how World War II interrupted our fathers' lives.
Yeah.
And so tell me what your dad was probably doing in those years that led up to, him having to go out and fight. Where did he go to high school? Did he go to college?
Yeah.
Was he working? Do you know anything about that?
I do, actually, because he grew up in Redlands, which isn't too far from Los Angeles. We would go out there, and what I know is he was raised in very extreme poverty. They were very, very poor, like many families during the Depression, which is when he came of age, born in 1914. So he was, in his teens during the Depression, and went to high school, started college, worked in the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was one of Roosevelt's programs to get men up into the hills and digging trails and whatnot, and had some great photos in scrapbooks around that. But you're right, Ken. It's hard to just kind of think of a life disrupted. Here again, I'm old enough that many of my friends went to Vietnam, so I know what that was like. And that this was just the whole country got disrupted versus, a certain group at a certain age.
Yeah, Pat, speaking of your dad's service and what he experienced, did he talk much about it? We kind of talked about how these guys never really did, but did he tell you much about it? Did he bring back any mementos or anything from the war?
Yeah, well, we have his uniform that are right here, so we can talk about that. The other thing he brought back, which I grabbed, is first of all, he didn't talk about it very much, and when he did talk about it, it would be some silly anecdote, kind of at his expense. It'd be a funny thing. He talked about being constipated, and just weird, just things that really had. I mean, you could just tell he wanted to shy away from the real gore. However, my mom would talk about the fact that he had night terrors his whole life. So he would wake up in the middle of the night with the night terrors. We weren't aware of that as kids, but later in life, my mom shared that with me. And a very close friend of mine who saw action in Vietnam, his wife shared the same thing. That he was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam and, became an international banker, but his whole life, he's had these night terrors. But this is a samurai sword
Wow.
that he brought back from Japan that I would play with as a little kid. I mean, you can't believe the steel on this sword. And I thought, oh yeah, and you see all these, you know, uh, I don't know what they are, tourist gimmicky
Yeah,
samurai
replicants. Yeah,
sword,
yeah.
and I kind of, this is heavy, and like I said, I mean, this is an
The real
amazing,
deal.
So just as a coincidence, when I was an executive at Disneyland, one of the artists that worked for me was a samurai sword collector. And I said, it's funny, I've got this old sword that my dad has kicking around the house. Can I bring it in, Joe Takahashi? And, oh yeah, I can figure it out. And so what they do is they unbind the wrapping here, and there's a little stone kind of marking thing in here. And it turns out this sword, he gave me the name, is by a very famous sword maker, and it was made in the 1660s.
No.
Yes.
I would say that's a huge memento from the war that he got. Holy smokes.
And it's, the steel is like, and we've never cleaned this. We've never, so, and yet this was a toy for me as a kid, my brother and I.
Well, it's funny you say that because Ken, you wore Dad's army boots that he brought home to shovel snow in, right?
Yeah, I would put
Yeah.
those things on and go out and shovel the snow, and they were not very waterproof. They weren't great boots, and they were not very comfortable. So I don't know how he marched all over Europe in those things, and his feet didn't just get destroyed.
Yeah. And we always when we play poker as kids, it was on an army blanket thrown on the table.
Wow.
And we never thought of like, oh, here's this army blanket. Isn't this something? It was just like, this was cheaper than buying a new poker cloth or whatever. So I think there was a lot of, here again, my generation, maybe close to yours, Ken, that where the war was still in the system here in the States, a lot of the,
It's something you bring up that I think is kind of interesting. We went and talked to a guy that knew a lot about uniforms when we were with each other there in California.
So
and we learned that it seems like these guys really didn't care too much about the stuff they brought home. They cared about some of it, like Dad had pictures and some things, but other parts that were just part of their uniform and part of their gear, that was just something they had to carry and something they had, where we treasure those now, like the blanket you're talking about. Let me ask you a little bit, kind of fast forwarding to when your dad retired from the military. What kind of impact did that have on your family and him, actually?
Well, he had a heart attack, and
Oh my
so
goodness.
it was a big impact, and it was actually the year I was born. I'm not sure the two things were related, but they could have been. But he had the heart attack before I was born, so I'm off the hook. But they were in Germany. They were living in Germany at the time, so he was part of two kind of post occupations, which he was in Japan during the occupation with MacArthur, but then they also lived in Munich, Germany. My family, my older brother lived there. I was conceived in Munich, and that would have been somewhere like 48 to 52-ish. So, and he was a career. That was what he was going to spend the rest of his life as a career officer. He was a captain, and he had a heart attack, and it was devastating, really, to the family. I mean, they lived kind of a high life as officers' family. They had a housing, they had a butler, they had pretty amazing lifestyle, and then suddenly he came home. He was hospitalized in the Presidio up there in San Francisco. He fortunately defied doctor's orders because at the time in 1953, heart attacks were treated with bed rest. And my dad said, "Screw this." He was an athlete, a football player when he was young, and he got up and walked around and exercised, which is the thing we know now is what you do for a heart attack. So I think he lived a long life because he defied doctor's orders.
So
But
I'm assuming, Pat, that that samurai sword he picked up in Japan when he was there after Japan had surrendered.
yes, that's right. Yeah. So he was in the Battle of Okinawa is one of the things Chris and I learned from Jack Luter, the officer. This little um, arrowhead is the symbol of having been a part of an amphibious landing. So
Mm.
and Okinawa was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific theater, and so he was part of that. And it's amazing. Just before we got on, just for the heck of it, because you guys have just turned me into detectives, around this World War II stuff. I've looked him up a couple of times, Okinawa, Raylinn Pattison, it's just kind of, and suddenly I went, you know what? I'm going to put his name and his serial number in Google. And it was like, bang. And a confidential report, Army report came up. And it has a blow by blow of this battle I'm trying to remember the name of the island chain, Ryukyu Islands, which is Okinawa. And there he is, First Lieutenant Raylinn Pattison, listed as one of 10 officers that are part of his battalion and division. And it goes through the whole battle as a confidential report internally in the Army as kind of a post-mortem. What worked, what didn't work. We should have had more of this. And I don't know if you guys have come across any of those reports, but it's extremely detailed.
Did
Yeah, they're
you?
called after action reports.
There you go. Okay.
Nice, Ken.
Yeah. I,
Did you?
I was shocked.
Do you think that it was recently declassified? Do you think that you just discovered it and that's why you haven't been able to find it?
Well, no, I don't know. I don't know. The Google algorithm just liked having that specific serial
Connection.
number as opposed to a division or anything else. Because like I say, I mean, you guys have been doing this for a few years now, but that was a surprise to me that it came up finally.
So your dad was in the 96th Infantry Division of the Army, and
Right.
he was working in the artillery area, is my understanding. Is that correct?
Field artillery, yeah, the 363rd Field Artillery Battalion, so of the 96th Division. So he was part of, and I believe you guys have a friend that was part of the Deadeyes.
Yeah, so this is interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned the Deadeyes because that's what the
Yeah,
96 nickname is,
right.
and they have a terrific website for anybody that is interested in the 96. It's called rememberthedeadeyes.com. There you go.
There's
Yeah. Yeah, I know it's interesting that patch. I'd love to know the design behind it because they had very specific reasons of the design that was put together for that. And that one looks like a blue diamond and maybe a yellow diamond together.
yeah,
Or
yeah. I agree with you, Ken. It's just, I mean, there's a whole book on the symbolism of military insignias that
yeah,
would be wonderful to be a part of. This
yeah.
is this is the Japanese uh, occupation patch.
Oh,
So that we
interesting.
started,
It
and that
almost
was
looks like a maple leaf almost,
I
doesn't
know,
it?
I
Yeah.
know,
Yes.
and
Huh.
those are the kind of crazy things that until you really dig in, like you guys have done, I
Yeah.
would make something like that up. Like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, he must have been in Canada for a while.
Right. Or maybe it's a leaf from a cherry blossom because they have
Yeah,
so many cherry blossoms in Japan. Maybe it has to
maybe
do with
so.
that. It's
Yeah,
just fascinating. But to your point that you had mentioned, yes, we have a connection to the 96th. My brother-in-law, his father was in the 96th Infantry Division, just like your dad, and
wow.
he was related to artillery, but the difference is he was embedded with a Navy officer, and he and this Navy officer would venture up to the front lines, and they would call in the artillery from the ships, not the field artillery, but the
Right.
ships themselves to bomb emplacements. And he was with the 593rd JASCO unit, and he was attached to the 3rd Battalion, 383rd Regiment of the 96th Division. So he did similar work to what your dad did, and was on the same islands. He was on New Britain,
Okay.
Leyte, Luzon, and Okinawa. And I
Okay.
imagine, I know your dad was on Okinawa, but he may have been on some of those same islands.
Yeah, I know he was late tea because Jack showed us something that told him that, divine something in the tea leaves. And
Hmm.
and I looked up those battles, and just to give you a sense of how big they were. So 12,500 killed, 49,000 casualties on our side. 150,000 civilians were killed on Okinawa, and 110,000 Japanese defenders were killed in that
Wow.
battle. I mean, when you think that all of Vietnam was 50,000 men, these were single battles where half of that happened, or in the case of the Japanese, double that in one battle. So,
That's
the scope of World War II, I think, is lost on any of us that weren't there. It's just so big.
You make a huge point, Pat. I mean, it's just remarkable, and it's so good to learn these things about your dad. And there always seems to be a connection with another soldier that we've read
Oh,
about or
wow.
we've heard about. I mean, we talked about how, our dad met his brother, our uncle, when they're across the country
Yeah,
in Europe, in another, whole other country. And of
yeah,
course, these connections that we've seen, like, with Ken's brother-in-law and his it was his father, right? Ken?
Yeah, it was his father was in the same division as Pat's father.
wow.
It's remarkable.
Yeah.
So Pat, and we've talked about it a lot,
Yeah,
but we got an opportunity to do some incredible things in California. We went up to Camarillo, right? And that's where they have the SoCal Wing Museum. And that's where we met Jack Luter, who had all these incredible insights to both your dad's uniform and our dad's uniform. Tell us a
yeah,
little bit about what we saw there.
yeah. Well, that was really one of my favorite things we did when you came out, Chris, and I appreciated you making that effort. And so, yeah, the CAF Commemorative Air Force SoCal Wing really is devoted to World War II history. So Jack, I ran into when I filmed the previous segment up there, and we went up in a PT-19, the trainers. We can go up for those of your listeners and viewers that might come to California. This is a place you can go actually fly in these planes. But yeah, Jack is an expert on what all this means. I mean, when you realize, you look at the olden days, all their medals would have been these big chunks of uh, metal hanging off their chests. At some point somebody went, yeah, you know what, let's color code these, just turn them into little bars.
Hmm.
And so they've always been a mystery to me, but every one of them, this is the good service medal. I remember he said this is because my dad was in the service before December 7th, 1941. I guess they wanted to call out the guys that were already defending. I think it was American defense. These were the guys that were defending the country before there was even a war. Like I said, that's the amphibious one. This is uh, military star, action star, and we noticed that there's a little hole here. And so Jack said, "There's probably another one of these that belongs here." And I said, "So Jack, do you apply to the army?" Or he goes, "eBay."
Let's go buy it on eBay.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's crazy. I
I don't know.
learned so much about dad's stuff too. I mean, it was just so
Wow.
amazing. And to give Jack credit and everybody who's
Oh,
like, what is this all about? You can watch this episode coming out soon, and Pat will
yeah.
go over where people can find that at the end of our chat here. But Jack was talking about how dad was really quite tough, being not a tall man. And we talked about this already in the podcast,
Yeah.
carrying
Yeah.
a huge rifle and being a really great shot. Something that caught me when Jack said, your dad was a killer. He was
Yeah.
tough. he was
Yeah.
one of the best out there. And I just was so amazing to me because I thought he just had this boring job of driving his commanding officer around in the Jeep, right, Ken?
Right. Yeah. When he said that, it really kind of sent a shiver down my spine that, Dad held back, just like you said, Pat. He always told the light stories. He talked about, oh, he went up to Norway and the sun didn't set till 2 in the morning. But, he skipped over the Battle of the Bulge and the battle in Verslin when they captured the first German city. But he talked about the lighter things and he had pictures of himself not in action, but he was short. So he took a picture of himself standing next to this 6'2" Norwegian guy, stuff like that. But, to hear Jack say your dad was a killer really kind of struck home with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, and it is amazing that because they didn't talk about it, and you can see why. I mean, it was not something. I mean, we're proud of him now, but my dad would talk about, he was a killer, but did you kill? Who did you kill? Did you kill? Those are the obvious questions that I don't think I'd want my kids to pry me on either. So I totally understand it.
Yeah,
And
their
by the
job
way,
was
I haven't killed anybody, so
we appreciate that in you. We you got to appreciate that, and I think it was a different time. They wanted to protect us from everything that could hurt us in one way, and I think maybe that's what our
well,
dads did.
yeah. And one of the things too, I think, does go back to the fact that it was such a common experience for that generation. That the the usual male one-upsmanship that sometimes can happen just seemed to not be there. Because they just all, there was nothing funny or uh, braggadocio about this experience of fighting
You
fascism in Europe and fascism in Japan
You make
was
such a great point, Pat, because if you think about it, that whole generation, each one of them served. So it
they
wasn't
they all yeah
special. It was something they did. It's only
yeah
special to us that didn't serve, that really appreciates what they did, right? So we put
yeah
them up on this pedestal and justifiably so. And they
yeah
didn't put themselves up there. So it was no big deal. It's what they did. And
yeah,
we talk about
that's
it.
right.
Plus, I don't know if I'd want to go over some of those things if I were them too.
Yeah.
All right. We
Well,
saw some
we'll,
Yeah.
other, go ahead.
we'll be talking to our kids about. Can you imagine shooting a TV show where you have, the lights aren't
It
working?
was
Oh
so
my,
scary. I was so
I
worried about
wake
my
up,
safety when that camera didn't record.
I still have night terrors.
Yes, exactly.
Just to finish up on that point though, because I think this is an interesting story to what you guys are saying about them not talking about it. So Woody Martin, who was in the 96, same division as your dad, Woody Martin first worked at a gas station after the war, and then he owned a bar. And one of the stories I read that his son Tom wrote was that a man that knew Woody said that when people would come in, it was either the gas station or the bar, I can't remember. These soldiers would come in and they'd start talking about their war experience and kind of bragging and things like that. Woody would just busy himself either sweeping up or doing something else and just walk away. And this man always thought that Woody walked away like that because he hadn't served and he had no stories. And the truth behind it was that Woody had seen so much raw action that he didn't want to have anything to do with it. And he thought those men were braggarts and they should not really be talking about it. And so he would just walk away from it and distance himself. Isn't that interesting?
That's great. Yeah, I love hearing
Yeah.
that. As you're talking, Ken, too, one of the stories that I have that I'm very proud of was not in the World War II, but during the Korean conflict. My dad was stationed in Korea, and one of the things that really happened during World War II and during this action was integration.
Mm.
Truman integrated the forces. There was a blending of classes, rich people, poor people, all different colors eventually, and my dad told the story of these guys, uh, some soldiers destroying a bike of a Korean gentleman just for fun, just for spite. And my dad was their commanding officer, and he made them go down. The group of them apologized to this Korean gentleman and repair his bike. and I would hear that story as a young man, and it really would make me understand. And my dad came from a redneck Okie background, and in terms of how that did, my girlfriend's dad fought at the Battle of the Bulge, and she's Jewish. He's Jewish. He had a Star of David on his dog tag, and there was extra evil done to those gentlemen if they were caught by the Germans. And these stories that I would hear that were like that, really implanted a sense of honor and pride in me around my dad, even though he didn't. After his time in the service, the big benefit we had is that we went to the military bases. I was born in a military base. My sister was. My brother was. We shopped at the PX. I used to get my Marine haircut done at the Marine base, 25 cents. It'd be me and my brother sitting in a lineup of active duty Marines with these two little kids with these big Marines, and the guy and it was literally maybe 20 barber chairs. And you'd hear the guy at the end, next, and you'd run down there, But I was always so proud of my dad's life experiences that came out of the war that kind of made you feel like, nobody's better, nobody's worse. We're just all dog paddling the best we can in this deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And in doing this podcast, I know for myself, and I think Ken too, is we've come to a better understanding of who our dad was.
Yeah.
And, as grown men now, a better appreciation of what he went through. And, surprised that he didn't smack us around more because we were little creeps and we didn't respect what he did. And so, yeah, he was, and it's like most of these guys, incredible, strong and patient men when it comes to, trying to do what's right. So let's switch gears a little bit. We saw some incredible things, and I want to get into them because it was amazing. So one of the best and one of the coolest places you took me to was Tustin, that had these old blimp hangars. And I didn't even know that these blimps were used during World War II. And you said, I think, that you kind of remember growing up with those hangars there. Can you give us a little background?
Well, so these were on the lighter than air base blimps, and LTA Tustin, and they were two of the world's biggest wooden structures in the world. And they are big enough. I think, what did they say, 17 stories? Wasn't it something ridiculous?
Like that, yeah.
And you can't get close enough to them so you can see the scale. But when I was young, and that was one of the places we'd get my haircut for 25 cents, we would pull on that base. So all of that area we went to, Chris, that road that we shot from, that was all part of the base at the time. So those were very far away. You got to realize Orange County, when I was growing up, was orange groves and ranches, And so I remember very well those bases. And one of them burned down not too many years ago. So it's very, very sad that we lost one of these pieces of history. But yeah, it's an amazing structure. They use it for film locations now. And it's one of those hidden in plain sight things that I'm glad our show can educate people, particularly this new generation, that really, you see how quickly stuff gets lost. I mean, it's amazing that we don't retain more of this history better. So that's part of our goal.
So, Pat, the Tustin hangar fires, what was that like? Because you were living during that time.
I was, and it's not that long ago. I think it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Oh, that recent.
And it was a big story, and unfortunately for the wrong reasons, that we lost this incredible piece of World War II history. But because of the time, the toxic materials that came off of this giant hangar, they had to evacuate neighborhoods that were downwind from the hangar. So it was one of those things that reminded me really of the fire there at Notre Dame, where you're burning something so old that there's no flame retardant. There's no, it's old chemically soaked materials. And so they couldn't put it out for a long time. So it was a big story here.
I bet you could see that from miles away.
You could, yeah, you could, Ken. It was very sad because those were two mementos from my childhood that, one of them's gone.
And they're just massive,
literally up in
Ken.
smoke.
It is like driving by a common day stadium. Like you drive by an indoor stadium and it's this huge complex. That's what these hangars are like. It's amazing.
Supposedly it had its own weather. There would be clouds would condense in this thing and they would drip. It was so big. Yeah,
the marine layer would actually build up inside the hangar.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Well, one other thing I want to circle back on, Pat, was when you visited with Jack, he mentioned to you, or you had shown him, an arrowhead pin on your dad's jacket that even stumped Jack. And so I'm really curious about that arrowhead pin.
So Jack found that, and it was actually a pin I had loose, not the one. The one on this jacket is the amphibious landing pin.
Okay.
So this is a separate arrowhead pin. My dad had some loose pins, and this was one of them, and it has a little triangle in it. So any of your viewers, if you know what the arrowhead with the triangle is, and I'll post it on Best of California, because that's my next detective job. And I know you guys have done quite a bit of this as well, right, Ken?
Yeah, and I hope one of your viewers responds, because that's the way we solve these things. And I bet you somebody out there knows that. But on my dad's jacket, we have his Eisenhower jacket. I think your dad's jacket was a little bit different model that you have there with you. His was one of the short-waisted coats, the Eisenhower jacket, and he had on his lapel a pin that was the French flag, and it's the Free French Forces pin, which he was not allowed to wear when he was in the army, but he attached it to his jacket later. We don't know how he got it. The Free French Forces were the resistance troops. So did he aid them in some way? Did he meet, a man or a woman that was part of that resistance? We still haven't figured it out. I don't know that we ever will, but it's one of those fascinating things to think about that our dads brought home from the war, didn't talk about, and yet we still can't quite figure out what it's all about.
Yeah.
It's a mystery. And you think about it. I mean, did they trade? Did he run into a French soldier and they traded pins, or they did something?
Were they like Disney World poison pins?
Exactly. I mean, I remember when my kid played travel baseball and you would trade pins with the opposing team. It was a big deal. So maybe it was something along those lines. But yeah, I love these mysteries. And we talked about it, and I know, Pat, you saw it. As my favorite part is that Dad came home with this prayer card that he made little tick marks at certain dates, and we didn't know what that was. And Ken did the research and found out that those tick marks represented places that Dad's infantry battalion separate, the 99th, was. And so he did this whole detective work, and it's amazing. He just unpacked this whole Pandora's box, like you said. It was a Rosetta Stone, if you will, to find out all these things about where our dad might be. So these mysteries are very cool, right?
Well,
Right.
to realize that each one of them probably from the outset had been trained to keep secrets, to do things in code. If anybody got captured, if something got lost, if somebody stole this thing and said, we're attacking on this day, instead it was little ticks or little things that, he could do in retrospect without giving away any information. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about our special trip and my special trip and our time together in California, one of the most remarkable places is something I didn't really know too much about until I talked with you, was this site in Goleta, right, where a Japanese sub attacked the continental United States.
Yeah, I think it's easy, particularly people that don't live on the West Coast, to not, when you think of the war in Europe and you think of Britain being attacked, there wasn't too much of a thought that New York was going to get attacked, but being where we are on the West Coast, and the fact that, Japan made it halfway to us by hitting the Hawaiian Islands, there was a very real concern that's why they were blimps, because they were patrolling the West Coast in the Leitern Air Base. But this place in Goleta happened a few months after Pearl Harbor, and a submarine surfaced. I can't remember the number of the submarine. I think it's in the segment we did, and shelled an oil field. I mean, it was a strategic shelling. It was going after oil supplies, and there was an oil field there in Goleta. There still is a functioning oil field in Goleta, like a lot of the coast of California. And it blew up a pier and some derricks, and the whole city lit up, and people were up on their roofs trying to, because you think about this, it feels almost silly. And there was that silly movie 1941 that, oh my God, but it was a very, very real fear that and part of why the internment camps happened, was this idea of the other coming to get us.
You speak of that movie, and that was John Belushi, if I'm recalling the correct movie.
Right.
And it was a farcical kind of movie, but that was one of the only representations of what they call the Battle of Los Angeles. And we talk about that on your show as well, where they were scared, and so I think a meteorological balloon was flying by, and they didn't know what it was, and they opened up fire, and this battery shot, and they spent all these shells on there, and it turned out, like it was just this balloon. It wasn't being attacked.
And a couple people got killed, I believe.
Yeah, it was horrible. So, and you think about that, and the only way that we can, come to terms with that is probably how scared we were, on September 12th, the day after 9/11 in 2001, where we didn't know what was going to happen next, shortly thereafter, and we were fearful. So I can only imagine what the West Coast was thinking about, because, being somebody that's from Colorado, now I live in the Midwest, we don't realize how close, that whole West Coast was to being a big part of the war.
Yeah. So that was the only attack on continental United States, I believe. There are some ships north that were also sunk by one of the submarines. So there's some offshore casualties, not human casualties, but some boats that are still out there off of Cayucas.
The damage wasn't too great to that, but they had to, of course, tear a lot of that down. And some amazing things happened to some of the remnants, right?
So this is kind of how the whole thing unfolded. This is why I love this detective work, is that I went in to this place for my show called the Timbers Roadhouse. And I was having lunch there, and the guy started talking to me, and he said, see those burn marks up there in the wood? And I said, yeah. He said, well, that's from the Japanese attack. And I said, wait a minute, that Japanese attack is close to here? He said, oh yeah, it's Goleta Beach. It's right down the street here. And I just went, oh my gosh, and that was when I knew about the attack, but I didn't know where it was, and that it was this place. So Ken, it was fun to take Chris from the actual battlefield and say, hey, you want to go have lunch and see some mementos of that battlefield? And he's like, what are you talking about? We did the same thing, pointed up into the rafters, and there are these burn marks and whatnot. It's incredible.
Well, I have to ask you, Pat, and this is really important for my next trip to California.
Yeah.
How is the food at the Timber Roadhouse?
The most important thing, see this spoiled boomer generation. We're talking about all this horrible stuff, and my latte wasn't quite to my liking, Ken. No, I'm kidding. No, it was good food, as I recall. I think I had a salad, or what did you have?
I had like a fried chicken sandwich that was really tasty, and we had a good time there. And it's just kind of weird to be part. You're in this historical kind of place with these things that were destroyed, and they reclaimed it, and then there's a great story behind it with the owners and whatnot. So it was just. It was a wonderful trip. And Pat, I can't thank you enough for inviting me out. I know that we kind of connected working on your show, and then we talked about both having World War II dads and how much that meant to you. And I said, oh, you got to meet Ken, my brother. We do
Yeah,
this whole
so great.
podcast, and we just kind of spun it all into this whole thing. Ken got the bonus of going and retracing dad's steps to Europe and looking at all that kind of stuff. I got to go on my own and see the stuff in California. So I'm
Yeah.
getting there, just not as fast as Ken and not as far just yet.
Well, I don't know. Thank you so much, Chris. It was so great for you to come out, and thank both of you for reigniting my interest. I'm a history buff, but it tends to be California history. But when you can attach history to a person, particularly if it's a family member, what a difference it makes. And I don't know if both of you have the same regret, but my regret is that this travel didn't happen while they were alive. And that I think about it now. I think about all the places I traveled all over the world in my career, and I could have grabbed my dad, thrown him on a plane, and taken him to Okinawa. And I didn't do it.
Pat,
And
it's so funny you say that because Chris and I talk about that a lot, how we missed the opportunity to talk to dad about these experiences because,
yeah,
when we were younger, we were so busy starting our own lives, we didn't stop and think about their lives. And
totally.
now that we're older and they're gone, we're starting to do that. And unfortunately, they're not here to speak to them. But with our detective work, we can figure those things out.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I have to say, Pat, from one son of a World War II dad to another, it's been great to learn about your World War II dad and hear about his history and the connections it has to my brother-in-law's dad that was in the same division. It's just such a small world.
Well, the fact that both of our fathers fought in two of the worst battles, the biggest battles, European theater, Battle of the Bulge, Pacific theater, Okinawa, is saying a lot. I
Mhm.
mean, we were raised by some pretty tough guys.
We
You're
should feel
absolutely
proud.
right. We do
Yeah.
feel proud. You're absolutely right, Ken. And Pat, please share with us where people can see Best of California.
Sure. So we air all over the place nationally. We're here in Los Angeles on Me TV, KAZA, and up and down California, CW affiliates. But probably the best thing to do is to go to bestofcal.tv, where they can kind of see where they can air it in their own area. I also just tell people anymore, just go into their whatever their cable service is or whatever they're watching and do the search Pat Pattison Best of California, and it'll come up. It's on Roku, Tubi. So,
And you have a website too with some past episodes. Is that correct?
yes, you can go to YouTube and here again, go to Pat Pattison's Best of California. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks, Chris.
terrific
Yeah.
time. No, my friend, it was wonderful. You had this great thought, and I really enjoyed our time together. And maybe if he's nice to me, I'll bring the older brother with me the next time we
Oh,
come.
do it in a heartbeat. Ken, you got to come out too and be a ball. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love it.
That's a lot of fun. And he had me run him around Hollywood too. We did a little
Did a
Hollywood
little
sign,
sightseeing.
Hollywood forever. So it was a lot of fun.
Good
Absolutely.
times.
Thanks again, Pat. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks,
Take care.
Pat. It was so great to talk to Pat and learn about his World War II dad. And it was amazing to me that he felt the same way we did about the regret we had that we didn't ask these questions of our fathers when they were still alive, but also the urge we also have to learn about their World War II history.
Yeah, it's driven us to do what? This is our eighth episode of this podcast where we're striving to learn more about our own father and then in the course of that, learning about other World War II dads out there. So it has really given us this fire, right? That we have to learn as much as we can because there's a little bit of regret that we didn't do it when these great men were alive, right?
Right. That's exactly right, Chris.
So one other thing, Ken, that I didn't get to share with you, and I wish Pat and I would have an opportunity to kind of explore this a little bit more, but some of the research and some of the information on balloon bombs.
A balloon bomb? What's a balloon bomb?
Balloon bombs. So back, I learned this is pretty cool. Back in November of 1944, Japan started launching what were called Fugo balloon bombs, which were filled with hydrogen and they're more like a paper like material because the rubber that we use for a balloon of this sort, think of a weather balloon, was so scarce back in that time. So they filled these paper and some other material with hydrogen and they had these balloons that carried a payload of four 11-pound incendiary devices and one 33-pound high explosive anti-personnel bomb. And they would put these bombs up into the jet stream and they would be carried over, hopefully, in their mind, to the United States. And I guess some of the things that they were looking to do is start forest fires with them. Isn't that crazy?
That's that's incredible. So they weren't able to steer them at all. They just launched them and hoped something would happen.
Yeah, it was, there's no controls, and they just wanted to either start, forest fires or just create panic that this could happen to you. And, a couple of them were found after the war. I think in North America, they had about 330 that they discovered, which was more than you'd ever think, because I never heard about this, right? These remnants of these
Right.
bombs.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there was one that was lethal that happened up in Oregon. And if you think about it, that was probably only the fatalities on the continental United States caused by an enemy combatant. Because, no, not that I know of, other than Pearl Harbor, where
Right.
any Americans, that's not even continental United States, and it wasn't even the United States at that point, right? But the continental United States with these balloon bombs that caused, casualties like that. So it was incredible. Some of them, I guess, were shot down, and they were even found. These remnants of these balloons were found like up until 1970. They were still discovering them because if you think about it, they put them up in the jet stream. They have no idea where they're going. They went
Hmm.
all over North America, so they'd land in forests or deserts or wherever, and some of those places haven't been really too inhabited. So pretty
That's
cool.
really interesting. I didn't know that story about World War II and that we were attacked here in the continental United States and we actually lost lives. I'm assuming they were civilians just
Yeah,
by
because there's no
happenstance.
yeah, there's no way to direct these things. They couldn't put them to a military base or any kind of, they just kind of, they're somewhat terrorists of the day, if you think about it,
Right.
where they didn't really
True.
care where it went. So it's pretty incredible. So about this California trip, I
Yeah.
I just thought it was really cool. Um, I have to tell you, I was amazed at how California really wasn't prepared for this war. And if you think about it, they maybe should have been because of how close they were to Japan. But I think the events of Pearl Harbor really just woke them up quickly.
Hmm.
And we
Hmm.
talked about it with Pat, how that, in Goleta with the I-17 Japanese sub attack, that happened, a couple months after that. We also talked about how, I discovered when I was with Pat that in like Christmas Eve, right after, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor,
Hmm.
there's a planned attack on the San Diego Bay because,
Hmm.
that was a big naval base then too.
Hmm.
So what I thought was remarkable, and that was called off, thank God, about 20 miles outside of the bay. But what I think is remarkable is that they weren't prepared, but boy, did California get geared up quickly. Those blimp hangars were built. They built up such an incredible response and got so ready that it spurred on a whole new industry that still exists today. I mean, California is so well known for aerospace and aviation and defense research and R&D and manufacturing. And you got to think that's credited to, how they had to get ready for World War II in a hurry.
Yeah, it is fascinating to think about. And California is such a strategic location relative to the Pacific and the defense we have to have from there, as well as the offensive things we can do launching out of there and having so much military along that coastline ready to react to any kind of situation in the world.
Yeah, it was amazing, and I was so thankful to Pat and the ability to go out and see those things. And I know there's probably some future trips for you and I to go
Mhm.
investigate these things because it's a passion of ours. And as we discovered, everywhere we go, there's a story of another great soldier from this greatest generation in World War II, right?
Yeah.
Well, Ken, we are at the end of another episode. They just seem to go by so fast when we do these things. So I know you, as well as I, really are so grateful to our viewers and listeners for, enjoying the journey with us, right?
Absolutely. We're so thankful to have folks tell us their stories, and we'd love to hear from you. So don't forget to drop a comment below on YouTube, leave a review on the audio podcast, or send us a message at our World War II Dad at gmail.com. That's our WW2DAD at gmail.com.
Yeah, we really appreciate it, and we want to continue our journey in finding out more about World War II dads, moms. I talked about the wax. We really like to learn more about everybody that served because there's always, like we said, a story out there. And before we go, we got something incredibly special lined up for our next episode. We have a powerful conversation with a World War II doctor's son and grandson as they share incredible stories of their father and grandfather's service. And this doctor was serving with our World War II dad in the same small 99th Infantry Battalion separate. So you really don't want to miss that episode. I'm so looking forward to that. So for my brother, Ken Cangilla, I'm Chris Cangilla, and we thank you for joining us for our World War II Dad.
Thanks for watching and listening to Our World War II Dad. Please remember to like and subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss an episode.
And if you're just listening to the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate it.